This is a fictional, dramatized reflection inspired by familiar family dynamics, not a claim about real people.
I sat in my car outside my aunt's house in Overland Park, Kansas, watching warm light spill through the front windows and into the driveway like the whole world was inviting me in. And for a moment, I almost believed it would be a normal night. February air pressed cold against the windshield. Somewhere inside, I could hear laughter and the clink of plastic cups, the kind of sound families make when they want a moment to feel simple. The heater in my car hummed. My hands stayed on the steering wheel longer than they needed to, because I'd already seen the email. It had popped up a minute earlier. The subject line so polite it made my stomach drop. Tuition repayment reminder. Month 86, from my father. No hello. No warmth. Just that clean, professional tone you use with someone you don't love. I stared at it until the word stopped looking like English and started looking like a label. Debtor. I'd been paying for years. Quietly. Automatically. Like a habit I couldn't break. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was normal. I told myself it was what responsible adults did. Then I stepped out of the car, pulled my coat tight, and walked toward the front door. The smell hit me first. Chili, buttered bread, and that faint scent of garage heater exhaust that always made winter gatherings feel half cozy and half improvised. My aunt hugged me too hard, like she was trying to squeeze the tension out of my shoulders. My mother smiled like she'd practiced it in a mirror. My brother Evan stood in the living room with a paper diploma frame in his hands, grinning, cheeks pink from all the attention. Winter 2023 graduate, 22 years old. Everyone's pride. My father clapped him on the back and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "That's my boy." People turned when I walked in, and I did what I always did. I smiled. I asked how everyone was. I said, "Congratulations." I kept my voice light. I kept my posture calm. I played the role I'd been trained to play since I was a kid, the one who never made things difficult, the one who never needed too much, the one who could be counted on to be fine. We spilled into the garage because the house was crowded, folding chairs, a long table with paper plates. A space heater rattles softly in the corner. My aunt's neighbor dropped off a tray of brownies like this was a small-town tradition, not a family pressure cooker. And then my father lifted his cup. He didn't tap it with a spoon. He didn't ask for attention. He already had it. We covered Evan's tuition. He said, so he won't start out with student loans. That's what parents do when they can. The room erupted in applause. Evan laughed, embarrassed in the way favored kids laugh when they're used to being rescued from consequences. My mother's eyes found mine immediately, sharp as a pin. "Smile," she mouthed. I smiled. My face did the thing it always did. But something in my chest went cold and still because I heard the rest of the sentence my father didn't say. We could. We chose. Just not for you. And suddenly, the email in my car wasn't a reminder, it was a confession. It told me my tuition had never been paid. It had been a leash, a way to keep me grateful. Quiet and small, while my brother got a clean beginning. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. I didn't feel angry the way people expect anger to look. I felt shock first, then something worse, doubt. The kind that makes you replay every family moment like you're finally watching it with the sound on. I looked at Evan's face. at my mother's proud smile, at my father's relaxed shoulders. And I realized they weren't celebrating his graduation. They were celebrating the story they'd been telling about me for years. And for the first time, I knew I was about to stop letting them tell it.
Be honest, if your own father emailed you like a lender, would you still call it family?
I didn't walk out of that garage. I didn't slam a door or make a speech. I stayed where I was, holding my cup, listening to people talk about Evan's bright future like it was a sunrise they'd personally ordered. And while my face stayed calm, my mind started doing something I hadn't allowed it to do in years. It started sorting, not feelings, facts. I'd been given a role in my family long before anyone handed me a repayment schedule. I was the first child, the easy one, the one who learned early that praise came when you made things simpler for everyone else. When I was 12, my mother used to tell relatives, "Natalie doesn't need much. She's so mature." It sounded like a compliment. I didn't understand that it was also a contract. It meant I wasn't supposed to ask for help the way other kids did. I wasn't supposed to take up space. If I got a good grade, it was expected. If I handled something alone, it was proof I could handle everything alone. Evan came later, and the air in our house shifted around him. He was funny, loud, always hungry, always forgetting something, always needing something. My parents called him sensitive. They called him creative. They said he just needed more support. When he messed up, they blamed stress. When I messed up, they called it a lesson. Even as adults, the pattern stayed clean. Evan was the investment. I was the return. He was allowed to be unfinished. I was expected to be functional. And the strange part is, I helped build it. I babysat, drove him to practice, covered small things when my parents were tired, because I thought that was what older sisters did. I thought love meant being useful. But standing there in that February garage, listening to my father talk about debt-free beginnings, I realized something that made my stomach twist. I wasn't being treated like the independent one because I was independent. I was being treated like the independent one because it was convenient. It kept their story tidy. It kept my needs invisible. It kept their favoritism looking like fairness. And that was the first time I let myself wonder, quietly and honestly, how many of my choices had been mine. In 2016, I was 19 and tired in a way that felt older than my body. I'd finished my first 2 years at community college, stacked my credits like puzzle pieces, and I was finally ready to transfer. I remember the day my acceptance email came through. I was standing in the break room at my part-time job, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my hands smelling faintly like dish soap. I stared at the screen and felt that clean rush of relief. Not joy, exactly. Relief, like I'd been holding my breath for years. And someone finally cracked a window. That weekend, my parents invited me over for dinner. My mom made baked chicken and boxed stuffing. My dad sat at the table with his reading glasses on, a manila folder in front of him, like we were about to discuss something important and grown up. I assumed it was a proud moment. I assumed he was going to say something simple, "As we believe in you." Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "We can help you, Natalie, but we need to do it the responsible way." He slid the folder toward me. Inside was a promissory note, printed and neat, with blank lines for my name and signature. He explained it in the same voice he used when he talked about car insurance. He said he'd seen family members borrow money and pretend it never happened. He said he didn't want resentment later. He said paperwork protected relationships. My mother nodded beside him, calm, almost relieved. Like this was a solution to a problem I hadn't known existed. I flipped through the pages. The numbers were there. The interest rate was low but real. The repayment schedule was mapped out month by month. The amount wasn't huge, but Dad insisted on stretching it out for years. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't supported. It was a loan with my father's handwriting at the bottom. I remember feeling heat crawl up my neck, the kind of shame that makes you sit straighter. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask why love needed a signature. But I also wanted to go to school. I wanted out of Overland Park, even if it was only 40 minutes away. I wanted a future that didn't depend on being easy. So I signed. My dad smiled, satisfied, and said, "Good. This will teach you discipline." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand, like I should be grateful for the lesson. On the drive home, I told myself it wasn't personal. I told myself they were just being careful. But even then, a small voice in my head whispered that something had shifted. Love had turned into paperwork, and I had just agreed to be treated like a risk.
That moment you signed something for your parents, did it feel like adulthood or like a warning?
After that dinner, school stopped feeling like a dream and started feeling like a bill that followed me everywhere. I transferred the next fall, and I did what I had always done. I adjusted. I took the earliest classes so I could work afternoons. I picked shifts on weekends. I skipped anything that cost money unless it was required. I didn't live on campus. I didn't decorate a dorm room. I didn't join clubs that met during my work hours. My college experience looked like parking lots and break rooms and late-night study sessions at a kitchen table with a cheap lamp and a half-cold cup of coffee. When friends talked about spring break trips, I smiled and said I was saving. When they complained about group projects, I nodded like I understood. Even though I was mostly just trying to stay awake, I told myself I was building character. I told myself the loan was fair. I told myself I was lucky my parents helped at all. But the longer I lived inside that schedule, the more I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't being taught discipline. I was being trained to accept a certain kind of love, the kind that arrives with conditions, the kind that keeps receipts. I finished later than most of the people I started with, not because I wasn't capable, but because I couldn't afford to be careless. Every semester was a balancing act. Tuition, rent, groceries, gas, and the monthly payment that came out of my account like a quiet tax for being someone's daughter. When I finally graduated, there wasn't a big celebration. My parents came, took pictures, and smiled the way you smile when something goes according to plan. My dad hugged me and said, "See? You're fine." My mom said, "We always knew you'd figure it out." And that was the moment the disappointment settled in. Fine wasn't praise. The fine was dismissed. It meant my struggle had become evidence that I didn't need them. It meant my exhaustion proved their system worked. I drove home from graduation with my cap on the passenger seat, staring at the road. And I realized I wasn't proud the way I thought I would be. I was empty. Not because I didn't love what I'd achieved, but because I could finally admit the truth. I had finished school the hard way, and my family had learned the wrong lesson from it. The first time I noticed my parents shifting money toward Evan, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. That was my reflex. Doubt your own perception first. Because questioning the family story always felt like the real crime. In 2018, Evan was finishing his junior year of high school, and suddenly, our kitchen conversations were full of words I hadn't heard when I was his age. SAT prep, tutoring, campus visits, application fees. My mother started keeping a folder on the counter with brochures and checklists. My father talked about Evan's future the way he talked about investments, with calm confidence and a sense of ownership. When Evan said he wanted to retake the SAT, my dad pulled out his wallet without hesitation. When I was 17 and asked about a test prep course, my mom had said, "If you want it, you can save for it. It'll teach you responsibility." Now, responsibility looked different. It looked like support. It looked like a belief. Evan toured schools out of state. My parents booked hotels. They drove him across Kansas and Missouri like it was a family adventure. I watched it happen in real time. The same parents who told me to stay local and be practical now acting like distance was exciting. I didn't resent Evan for being loved. I resented the way my parents spoke as if this was normal, as if this had always been their standard. One night, I asked my mother, gently, "Why didn't we do any of this when I was applying?" She didn't look up from her paperwork. She just said, "Natalie, don't keep score," my father added. "He's different." That phrase hit like cold water. Different how? Different because he was younger. Different because he was a boy. Different because they liked the story of him more than the story of me. I tried again a few weeks later, this time with my dad. I said, "You made me sign a loan. You're paying for his test prep and his tours." He frowned, like I was being unreasonable. He said, "You turned out fine. He needs a little more help." Fine. Again. Fine was the word they used to erase the cost. Fine was the word they used to turn my struggle into proof that I didn't deserve softness. I went home that night and sat in my apartment in the quiet, realizing something I didn't want to admit. My parents weren't supporting Evan because they had more money now. They were supporting Evan because they believed he was worth investing in. And the moment I saw that clearly, the disappointment turned into something heavier, a slow, sinking understanding that this wasn't about fairness. It was about favoritism, dressed up as wisdom.
Have you ever watched your family reward the same behavior they punished you for?
The proof didn't come in a dramatic confession or a heated argument. It came the way most family truths come, by accident, when someone gets careless. In the fall of 2019, Evan had just started college. I'd already graduated by then, working full time, trying to build a life that felt like mine. One Saturday, my mom asked if I could come over and help clear out the garage. They were reorganizing, she said, and my dad needed an extra set of hands. I showed up in old jeans and a sweatshirt, expecting dusty boxes and the familiar ache of doing unpaid family labor, because it was easier than saying no. The garage smelled like cardboard and motor oil. My dad had a folding table set up near the back, and on it sat a printer, a stack of papers, and a laptop open to a school portal. He didn't even look embarrassed. He just said, "Good timing." We're getting Evan's tuition stuff sorted. My mom was taping labels onto bins, humming softly. Evan wasn't there. He was away, living his new life. I started lifting boxes, but my eyes kept drifting to the table. Pages slid out of the printer in clean, official fonts, financial aid forms, billing statements. A receipt with a university logo at the top. My dad picked one up, glanced at it, and set it back down. Then the next page printed, and the words landed in front of me like a slap. Semester balance, $0. Payment posted. I stared at it too long. My dad noticed. He followed my gaze, then casually turned the paper over like it was nothing. But it was something. It was everything. I didn't ask questions right then. That was the strange part. My body went still, like it was protecting me from a feeling too big to hold in that garage. I kept working. I carried boxes. I smiled when my mom made small talk. I acted normally because I didn't yet know what normal would look like if I stopped. But the moment I got back to my apartment, I pulled out my own folder, the promissory note, the repayment schedule. The monthly auto withdrawal had been leaving my account for years. I laid it all out on my kitchen table like evidence. Not to punish anyone, not to start a war, but to finally see the story clearly. My parents had made my education a debt and my brother's education a gift. They had taught me that love came with paperwork, and then they turned around and gave Evan love without conditions. The shock wasn't just that they did it. The shock was realizing they never thought I would notice. By the time February 2024 arrived, I wasn't carrying anger into my aunt's house. I was carrying clarity. That's the part people misunderstand. They think public truth is always fueled by rage. Sometimes it is fueled by exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding your tongue so long your own voice starts to feel unfamiliar. The gathering itself looked harmless. A crowded living room, paper plates balanced on knees, a TV playing quietly in the background because someone forgot to turn it off. Then the spillover into the garage, where folding chairs lined up beside a long table covered in chili, cornbread, and a tray of brownies. A space heater rattled in the corner, making the air smell faintly like warm dust. Everyone was dressed in winter layers, coats draped over chair backs. People laughed a little louder than usual, as if volume could make the moment feel bigger. Evan stood near the table, holding court the way younger siblings do when they're used to being celebrated. He looked happy, and I meant it when I told him I was proud. That was never the issue. The issue was the story my parents kept writing around him, and the way they kept editing me out. When my father lifted his cup, the room quieted without him asking. He didn't tap the plastic. He didn't need to. My dad has always had that kind of authority in a room, the kind that makes people straighten their shoulders. He smiled at Evan and said, "We covered Evan's tuition each semester, so he won't start out with student loans. That's what parents do when they can." Applause broke out immediately. My aunt clapped. My mother's eyes shone. Someone behind me said, "That's amazing!" Evan laughed, cheeks red, and for a second, he looked like a kid again. My mother's gaze snapped to mine like a command. "Smile." She mouthed it. I did smile, but I also felt my hands go calm, not trembling, not clenched, calm, like something inside me had decided there would be no more pretending. I stood up, not dramatically, just enough that people noticed. My heart was loud in my ears, but my voice came out steady. I said, I'm proud of Evan. I really am. I don't want to take over this night." Then I paused, because I wasn't going to ramble. I wasn't going to perform pain for an audience. I said, "I just want the truth to stay the truth." My father's smile tightened. My mother's face changed. Just slightly, I continued, still looking at Evan, not to blame him, but to keep him human in the moment. My tuition was treated as a loan. Evan was paid for. I'm done pretending that's equal. The garage went silent in a way I could feel in my teeth. No one laughed, no one argued. People just looked down at their plates, like the air had shifted. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin envelope. I didn't wave it. I didn't read the numbers. I simply set it beside my father's cup, close enough that only he could see it clearly. Then I sat back down. My hands were shaking under the table, but my face stayed quiet. Across from me, my aunt's sister stared at my parents with a look that wasn't judgmental. It was recognition. And in that moment, I realized public exposure doesn't have to be loud to be real. It just has to be undeniable.
Did you feel that silence too? The kind that only shows up when the truth finally arrives?
The night didn't explode after that. It didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. And the rest of the evening moved like a room full of people pretending they hadn't heard a fire alarm. Conversations restarted in smaller, quieter pockets. Someone offered Evan another brownie. My aunt asked if anyone wanted more chili. The TV kept murmuring in the background. But the warmth was gone. My mother stopped looking at me altogether, which was her way of punishing without making a scene. My father stayed seated, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on his cup as it had betrayed him. When it was time to leave, I helped clean up like I always did, stacking plates, folding chairs, doing the polite motions of family, even as something inside me separated. In the kitchen, my mother finally cornered me. Her voice was low, tight, controlled. "How could you do that here, Natalie?" Like I'd committed a social crime, not spoken a fact. I kept my tone even. I didn't do anything to Evan. I told the truth. She shook her head, eyes flashing. "You embarrassed us." The word "us" landed heavily. Not "you hurt me." Not "you scared me." Us. The family image. My father stepped in, jaw clenched. He didn't ask why I felt the way I did. He didn't ask what it had cost me. He said, "You could have handled this privately." I looked at him and realized how often private had meant silent. How often private had meant keep paying, keep smiling, keep being fine. I said, "I have handled it privately. For years." My mother crossed her arms. "And you still owe us." She said it like it was the final, unshakable truth. Then she added, softer, almost sweet, "You will apologize." That was the audacity. Not a request for understanding. A demand for obedience. I felt my chest tighten, not with anger, but with something like grief, because I could finally see what they valued. Not fairness, not love, compliance. I met my father's eyes. "I'm not apologizing for telling the truth," I said. "And I'm not paying a debt that was used to keep me smaller." My mother's face went blank. My father's nostrils flared. Behind them, I could hear my aunt laughing too loudly at something someone said, trying to stitch the evening back together. I walked out into the cold, and the consequences started before I even reached my car. The next morning, a cousin texted, "Why did you ruin Evan's night?" Another message followed. "Your parents did so much for you." I stared at my phone and realized the family had already begun rewriting the story. I didn't respond to the texts. That was my first act of justice, and it felt strangely unfamiliar. For most of my life, I had believed my job was to soothe things, to explain myself until everyone felt comfortable again. But comfort was the currency my family used to keep me compliant. So instead of arguing, I opened my laptop, not with fury, with precision. I logged into my bank and turned off the auto payment that had been leaving my account every month. Like a quiet confession, I created a folder on my desktop and labeled it plainly. Tuition, I saved the promissory note. I saved the repayment schedule. I saved the email from my father. Then I wrote one message back to my parents. Short and clean, the way you write when you want your words to stand out in daylight. I won't be making payments on this anymore. If you want to discuss it, we can do it in writing. I hit send and felt my stomach drop, because even when you know you are right, saying no to your parents can still feel like falling. 2 days passed. Then my father called. He didn't say hello the way he used to. His voice sounded like it had been sanded down. "Natalie," he said, "we need to talk." I let him speak first. He started with the same script. "You embarrassed your mother. You upset Evan. You made us look bad." I listened without interrupting, because I wanted to hear how far he could go without touching the truth. When he finished, there was a pause. Then he said it, like it was a reasonable compromise. "We just need you to keep paying until Evan finds a job." The sentence landed so cleanly I almost laughed. But I didn't. I just felt that old ache rise up, the one that comes from realizing someone still thinks you exist to absorb consequences. I took a breath. "Evan already has a degree," I said. "I'm the one you expected to stay quiet." My father went silent. Later that night, Evan called. His voice was small. "I didn't know. Nat, Mom and Dad never talked about your payments around me. I believed him, and that made it worse. That's the point." I told him gently. "You weren't supposed to." After I hung up, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my screen, and I understood something I wish I had learned earlier. In families like mine, silence is treated as consent, and paperwork is only used against the child they expect to obey.
Sometimes the most peaceful no is the one you put in writing. Oh, have you ever had to do that?
The months after I stopped paying were quieter than I expected, and that quiet taught me more than any argument ever had. My parents didn't show up at my door. They didn't threaten lawsuits or dramatic consequences. They did something more familiar. They withdrew. They acted wounded. They let the story travel through other people so they could keep their hands clean. I would get a text on my birthday from an aunt I barely spoke to, saying, "Your mom is heartbroken." I would hear through a cousin that my father thought I was ungrateful. No one asked what it felt like to sign a loan at 19. No one asked what it felt like to watch my brother receive what I was told I didn't deserve. But I stopped explaining. I stopped defending. And slowly, the panic I used to feel when my phone rang began to fade. By 2025, my life looked ordinary in the best way. I had a routine that belonged to me. I went to work. I came home. I cooked simple dinners. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I was tired of carrying guilt that wasn't mine. I learned a new language for what had happened. Favoritism, enmeshment, conditional love. I learned that boundaries feel cruel only to the people who benefited from you having none. Evan changed. too, in small ways. He didn't suddenly become a villain or a hero. He was just a younger brother who had grown up inside a story he didn't write. He called me a few times that year. Awkward and sincere. He apologized without making excuses. It wasn't a grand moment. It was a quiet one. And it mattered more because it wasn't performed. My parents never gave me the apology I used to fantasize about when I was younger. They never sat down and said, "We were wrong." They offered smaller things. A neutral text. A photo from the past. A holiday invite that sounded polite and distant. I accepted what felt safe and declined what didn't, without speeches. The biggest change wasn't what they did. It was what I stopped doing. I stopped paying to be included. I stopped shrinking to keep the peace. I stopped treating my own needs like an inconvenience. And in that space, something gentle grew. Relief. Not the sharp kind that comes from winning, but the quiet kind that comes from finally being free. I didn't cut them off in anger. I just stopped signing my future away for their comfort. And for the first time, I could breathe without asking permission.
What is one boundary you wish you had set years earlier, even if it meant disappointing your own family?